Welcome back. What I plan to do in this section is to do, it's actually a repetition of a lecture that I did in Ukraine and Belarus last year. It is based more for people who are learning and teaching English than anything else. So if you are interested in that, I hope you enjoy it. I call this particular lecture No Fear, No Frills, English for Enthusiasts. Because one of the main things that helps people learn anything is the desire to learn it. So it's always, as you know, much easier to teach an enthusiastic student than one who is not motivated and doesn't want to be there. When I was a teacher in Colombia, I would open the door to the classroom and say, if you are not interested in being here, there's the door. Nobody left. And why no fear and no frills? Well, I talked about fear before. This fear is the thing that is the biggest obstacle for people successfully learning how to communicate in English in this part of the world. 90% or 80% of the problems people have with English are psychological. They're not practical. And why no frills? Because we don't need to make it more complicated than it is. It's just speaking. Thank you. Okay, so a little bit of background. I talked about myself before. I was born a very long time ago. I was brought up in a county called Lincolnshire, which is a county famous for being flat and having potatoes. That's where I grew up. But I studied Russian at school and went to the University of Edinburgh, including a year in Voronezh, where I learned my Russian. I got my CELTA certificate. The people make a big deal of it. I have a CELTA. When I took it, if you were a chimpanzee with good grammar, they would give you the certificate and you paid the money. Fortunately, it has become a little bit better since then. But these qualifications, same as here, are things that you need to get through the door. Did they actually help me? Not a bit. As I said, I speak Russian, French and Spanish and bits and pieces of other languages, which I have learnt, yes, in a formal environment, but couldn't master them. And once I started living in places where these languages were spoken, I got more proficient. But I'm still learning. I worked in international business for 20 years. I travelled to 92 countries I have been to, and I have lived in 16. So, and I have seen English being taught in those 16 countries, and I have taught in a dozen myself. So I've seen all sorts of different methodology. I have taught in universities, I have taught university faculty staff, I've taught students, I've taught children from 5 years old and up. So I've taught at all levels. How I became a teacher was I wanted to become a writer. So I thought, I'm going to get my certificate, I'm going to go to Paris and I'm going to write a brilliant novel. Well, I have actually been published, but it wasn't brilliant. Thank you. That's what I do in my spare time, or used to. When I was a lot thinner, that's me in the middle, I was a terrible jockey, but I enjoyed it. And that's the book of short stories that I wrote. So why am I here? Or why do I go anywhere with my lecture? Why bother? Because not many people get a chance to listen to and interact with a native speaker. One of the biggest problems, if you're working in the university, for example, is the only time you hear English is in class or when you're reading some kind of journal. But to actually have a real live conversation and interaction with native speakers doesn't happen as often as perhaps you would like. That was my motivation for coming to Ukraine in the first place. To demonstrate what in my, and again, this is a purely personal opinion. I am not an expert in anything. But to me, there are things that are really important when you're learning English and things that are less important. And I believe that in many places, the two have become confused. So talk a little bit about British pronunciation and where it comes from and why it can be a very frustrating language to learn. In some ways, it's very easy, but it can become very difficult, particularly if you're talking about pronunciation versus spelling. How is it that that word looks like that, but we say it like that? English is not a phonetic language, but it used to be. So what's happened is we've changed the pronunciation, we haven't changed the spelling in 700 years. And to give a few tips on sound and vocabulary, grammar, that kind of thing. And there's a little bit on some of the stranger things that we do in English. The English are famous for being a nation of eccentrics, or crazy people. It depends how you look at it, and we are. Most of all, it is this, my life's work is dedicated to helping people not be afraid to speak and make mistakes. Это не грех, это ошибка. Thank you. Okay, so this is a map of what? It is a map of where English is the language. Thank you. But although English is the legal official language in 81 countries and territories, it isn't in Britain or in the federal United States. We have no law in Britain that says that English is our legal official language. De facto it is, de jure it isn't. And as I've said before, we have no academy. There is no overall authority on what is and isn't English, which means there are no rules, only conventions. Teachers hate it when I say that, because no, I teach rules, Sorry, there aren't any. So you study the history of the English language, you know a bit about it, but it's still worth revisiting because it helps explain why English can be very difficult. So originally, the people of Britain, well, we don't know what language they spoke. The people who built Stonehenge, the Beaker people, we don't know what language they spoke. The first recorded language, or known language that was spoken, were Celtic languages. And where are the Celts today? Who are they? Who are the Celts? Anybody know? No. They're the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish, the Britons, and the Cornish. And they still speak Celtic languages. Very few words survive in modern English from that time, although some do. The slang word for mouth, gob, comes from Gaelic. Then, of course, we had the Romans. And everyone thinks, oh yes, well, English has got lots of Latin in it. It must be from the Roman occupation of Britain. It wasn't. It wasn't. What we did get from the Romans were place names. Any of you who know Chester, Manchester, Leicester, Worcester, all of these cestas meant a Roman military camp. So you'll still see it in place names, but actually Latin did not leave its mark on the British at that time. What did was when the Romans left in 410 AD, and we were overrun by waves of Angles and Saxons and Jutes who came from modern day northern Germany, southern Denmark and the Netherlands. And then a little later we had the invasions of the Norsemen, the Vikings, who brought Old Norse. All of these languages had something in common. They were all Germanic languages. Now that amalgamated to form Anglo-Saxon, or Old English if you wish, And that was the language of the land. It was written down for the first time, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Beowulf, if you've been forced to read that. So Anglo-Saxon was the language of Britain. The Celts were marginalised, and to some extent still are. And then in 1066, the only date that British people know, is when William the Conqueror and the Normans invaded, and they brought with them their language, which was not French as we know it. It was Frankish, which was a mixture of Old French and Germanic dialect again. So again, we have a Germanic influence. But also, this is where the Latin influence came in as well, because of early French. And that was the birth of Middle English, the English of Chaucer, which if you read today, is impenetrable. Most modern English people wouldn't understand 3 words of Chaucer. They wouldn't understand an awful lot of Shakespeare. And I would suggest that most of them wouldn't understand an awful lot of Jane Eyre. Thank you. So you can see the roots that it took. But the English language is made up, as you know, of about 28% Latin, about 25% French, 25% Anglo-Saxon, and the rest from about 100 different languages. We're very accommodating when it comes to stealing words. And that process carries on today. New words are added and dropped out of dictionaries all the time. And dictionaries between themselves don't agree on what counts and what doesn't count. Here's the rule. If the other person understands the words you use, it counts. Give you an example. If you take the word shashlik, you look that up in a dictionary and it says barbecue. It's not barbecue. It is a different experience altogether. And you have to actually back it up with a cultural reference. The same one, the word in the English dictionary, dacha, it's not a country house. So you actually have to explain. And when you're speaking English, if you are able to get the other person to understand what you're saying, you can make up your own words. Nobody says you can't. It is completely valid. Because if you don't break the rules, you don't progress. If you thought about it, if you stuck to the rules, there'd be no Shakespeare. There would definitely not be James Joyce. Well, some people might think that's a good thing. There'd be many of the greatest artists of the English language wouldn't exist. Okay? Okay, so what is the most important thing here? Well, in your opinion, what is the most important aspect of good English?
Intonation.
So you've seen this before.
Pronunciation.
Pronunciation, not necessarily. But hands up who thinks it's grammar. I'm very happy to see no hands. A lot of people used to say that it was grammar. Vocabulary, obviously, you need words. Syntax, that's debatable. Pronunciation is important. Accent doesn't matter. Yes, the answer is thank you. Intonation. What you do with your voice is the most important thing in English, because we don't have the luxury of flexible word order like in Russian or Ukrainian. I use as an example Plastilinova Vorona. If you think about that, if you have to listen to everything because you don't know where the subject is. Одну простую сказку, а может не простую, а может и не сказку хотим вам рассказать. Where's the subject? It's all the way over here. It's хотим вам рассказать. So if you're listening to Russian or Ukrainian, you have to listen to everything. As we know, in English, you don't. Thank you. Listen to the Queen.
25 years ago, my grandfather broadcast the first of these Christmas messages. Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day.
Okay, beautiful. But a different language to the one I speak. In my lifetime, the English language has changed. We used to speak with very little intonation, very clipped, very high, very little emotion, very flat vowels. A lot of people from this part of the world will still say het and ket and happy because of this. But the short A, that hat and cat and happy, is a harder sound to produce because it doesn't exist. So in my own lifetime, because this is only a few years before I was born, the language has changed dramatically and continues to do so. Thank you. So, I had to listen to that about 12 times myself to understand what the hell I'm talking about. My brother speaks a little like that, lots of glottal stops and lots of slang, lots of street, and I'm not saying that for communicative English we need to teach this. Heaven forbid. But this is the reality of street English. There has to be a level between this and the Queen for effective English that is universally understood. Thank you. Okay, so I mentioned intonation. I talk about it incessantly. I'm like a broken record because it's so important and so often ignored. This quote, in parts of speech and vocabulary, the speech and vocabulary are the meat and drink of English. Then intonation is the seasoning, the spice, the colour and the flavour. Without it there is nothing but a bland and tasteless dish. That quote is from me, actually. And it comes to the fundamental thing, as I mentioned in the first half, why do we speak at all? And we know the answer, we've talked about the answer. How we listen is very different. Native speakers, as I say, do not listen to every word. We don't have to. We listen for the intonation. What I call the key words, what I call, the shtog dia pachon. Isn't that yesterday, supermarket, bread, cheese? So tell me yesterday I go, I don't care. So how do you make your words count? You make them count through the intonation. Okay, thank you. Some tips on pronunciation. As I mentioned before, mouth mobility is extremely important in English. We open our mouths wider than you do in Ukrainian. And also, it's not centered on the mouth, on this rather round shape. It is wider. People who smile a lot speak better English than people who don't. And that's true. And the reason is, these muscles in the cheeks, when you say ship or sheep, there is a huge difference, but you have to use these muscles. Typically, in a part of the world where people don't go around smiling in the streets so much, although I think they do a lot more here than they do further east, then these muscles aren't developed as much. And what happens is, these minimal pairs become much harder to distinguish. You need to exaggerate. Any of you who have children or pets, do not use the same voice talking to your children or your pet as you do to your colleagues. What do?
Patience.
You exaggerate. Basically, speaking English is like speaking to a rather stupid child. And it's actually true. Again, I talked about where your voice comes from. Russian, Ukrainian, mostly from the mouth. English, from the top of the chest. You have to visualize bringing your voice down, not in tone, but just where is it coming from? So as somebody said the other day, you speak from the heart. And that gives you a resonance, because all speaking is controlling the way we breathe out. Those people who sing, those people who do yoga, actually, if you can control your breathing, you can speak better English. Another thing that people do, they have a tendency to talk to their toes. Lift your head up, you chin up, and you project more. Because all speaking is public speaking, even if your audience is one. That mumbling, my father used to hate it when we mumbled. We were like beaten for mumbling. You know, don't talk like that. Talk as if you're talking to a room full of people, like now. Talking about forcing the air out. This is a big problem, not problem exactly, but it's something that is very noticeable between, for example, Ukrainian particularly, which is a softer language than Russian and more pleasant on the ear, I think, and English, is that in English you have more tension in the lips and you're forcing air out. So hence the Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled pepper. When Ukrainians say it, it sounds like bees. It sounds like Peter Piper. And the reason is that in Slavic languages, the air falls out of your mouth like a drunk man from a taxi. English is more about forcing the air out. Now, American English is more relaxed, but British English is more clipped, it is more forceful in that ejection of air. Long syllables are short, and short syllables are very, very short. Word stress. What do we do with unstressed syllables in English, unstressed vowels? We ignore them. We pay them no respect whatsoever. So if we take, for example, a word like condition, stress is on the second syllable, we say it longer, louder and higher than the others, and the other syllables, we ignore them. We treat them very badly. So it is impossible to say con quickly. You can't do it. What do you have to do? You have to change the sound. And that's where the good old schwa comes in, and it becomes kun. You can say kun really fast. You can say shun really fast. So you get condition. And that music, that intonation, is vital for understanding. So the schwa and connected speech. Now this is something I think is always useful to recognize, but it is not necessary to learn. It's very hard to learn it. You have to actually be in the environment. And again, for example, the schwa, the sound, banana, or as my son says it like a minion, banana. But banana or ice cream, there's an R in there somewhere, intrusion. Or go away, do you want a coffee? That's what you'll hear, which is why sometimes it's difficult. It's easier to understand a German speaking English than a native speaker sometimes, either American or British. We have problems understanding each other because they use rhotic R's and we don't. For example, the word squirrel in English, British English, squirrel. American English, squirrel. I can't even say it. It's impossible. But these are things. Now, there is a very good YouTube channel called Papa Teach Me. Papa Teach Me deals a lot with intonation, pronunciation, and connected speech. He's a fantastic teacher and voice coach. So I would recommend checking that out for those of you who are interested. But you don't need to learn it. It is something that is acquired with time. The difference is that when you are speaking, what happens is that there is a tendency to sound a bit robotic because every word is separate. That's fine. But if you add in good intonation, then you will always be easy to understand. Thank you. So, for example, 1,000 hairy savages sitting down to lunch, gobble, 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 gulp, gulp, munch, munch, munch. I use tongue twisters a lot in my classes. And how I get people to practice them is in front of a mirror, usually on their own. But the more that you practice, I think one of the best disciplines that you can give students is to get them to read aloud. I use a lot of poetry, a lot of song lyrics in my teaching because sound is so important. And as I said, it's quite often overlooked. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. Extraordinary performance.
Right, now,
Thank you for detaining my victim.
now this is an example of what you can do. You can exaggerate by drawing out the syllable for dramatic effect. And that was the voice of George Sanders, who in my opinion had one of the best speaking voices in English. I'll tell you who else. James Mason, the actor. And if you want to know perfect American intonation, Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise in the film Jerry Maguire has the perfect intonation. That's what makes him such a good actor for me, is the way he speaks. And of course, for British actors, if any of you know the film The King's Speech,
Yeah.
Colin Firth is an excellent actor. Thank you. So this is what a native speaker says, as I mentioned earlier. Yesterday I went to the supermarket and I bought some French bread, some Irish cheese and a bottle of red wine. Good shopping list. But what do we listen to? What do we hear? Thank you. That's what we hear. We don't listen to the rest of it.
Supermarket, yeah, we just hear this.
Exactly. And that works in English across, whether it's America or Canada or Britain or Australia. This is what we listen to. We don't hear. We don't listen to the rest of it. If my wife says, I don't listen to her at all, but that's not true. Next one, please. But if you change the intonation, you change the emphasis. Look at this sentence. My brother plays the violin in the kitchen every Thursday evening. You can change the emphasis of this sentence, not by changing the word order, but just by changing your voice. So in other words, if I want to tell you that it's not your brother, but it's my brother, what do I say? My brother. And if it's my brother and not my sister, my brother. Every single word in that sentence, you can, depending on what you want the other person to understand, you can change the intonation. So it's not just it's every Thursday evening. And if it's evening and not morning, every Thursday evening. And if there's only one famous violin in the house, plays the violin. Every word here you can change. So when you're speaking and when you're listening to your students, you need to make sure that you understand what it is that's important that you want them to understand or they want you to understand. And this is why working on intonation is so important and yet, sadly, so often ignored. Thank you. There is, those of you who are aware of TED Talks, I recommend them thoroughly. There is also a website called eslvideo.com. eslvideo.com is an excellent site and they put a lot of TED Talks in there and they do quizzes at different levels. And one of my favourite people to listen to is a guy called Julian Treasure. Julian Treasure talks about the human voice, how to speak and make people listen. And he talks about some of these things, about warming up your voice before you speak. So many people forget to actually breathe. Take a breath. Relax your shoulders. What happens when you're nervous, especially if you come to talk to a teacher, is that your throat tightens up. Your diaphragm becomes compressed, and whispers up here, and you come up really strong, really fast, nobody understands what you're saying. By breathing, relaxing your shoulders and having your ribcage relaxed, having good posture. Another reason why women speak English better than men here is that women have better posture because they've done ballet or gymnastics or something. They know how to carry themselves. Guys, sack of potatoes. Speed kills. Again, we mistake fluency for speed. It has nothing to do with speed. Some of the best speakers get the best results by slowing down. Pauses are your friend. What happens when you pause is you give your listeners a moment to assimilate what you're saying. You give yourself a moment to think about what you're going to say next. And also, you increase the effect and the impact of your words. And after all, it is the impact of our words that is so important. Speaking is singing. Of course it is. Different notes, fewer notes in some languages than others. Russian has fewer notes than Ukrainian, Ukrainian has fewer notes than English, English has fewer notes than Swedish, Swedish has fewer notes than Chinese. But they're still notes. When I say speaking is selling, what do I mean? What are we selling?
You want to deliver your ideas. We're selling ourselves like a person.
To a certain extent, yeah. We're selling the meaning of what we're saying. We're selling what we want. So grammar therefore becomes a distant second to the sound. And the reason is, the proof is, look at a country like the United States, 300 and whatever million people, country of immigrants, people from different languages, different nationalities, backgrounds, all speaking the same language. And most of them without formal training in grammar, but they understand each other. And so that's why I use the word freely rather than fluently. Free from fear. Thank you. I've seen this. I have actually seen this on a post. Learn lists of words every day, between 30 and 50 words. Always put the translation next to the English and learn the grammar rule off by heart and write out the sample sentences several times. Then, thank you. Shoot yourself. You cannot learn it that way. Learn one word a day or two. And how do you learn it? So there are some really good online dictionaries. For example, I use Cambridge Online Dictionary with an English definition and the sounds, because there's a little sound icon, whether it's British English or American English, usually a couple of sample sentences, and I write down the definition in a sentence that is relevant to me, about my life. I don't put any other language next to it, because then it becomes a memory test. You're not actually learning the application of the word, you're just theoretically recognizing it. And so what happens here in Ukraine, for example, there are some people who are fabulous translators. You could read any kind of technical journal, but you can't have a conversation. That seems wrong to me. So again, make the examples about your life. If you're learning a conditional, ask yourself, what would I do if? Again, don't write down the translation. A game I play with my students at all levels is a game I call Taxi. Imagine for a moment that I am an alien, not hard, and I don't know what a taxi is. I don't know the concept of taxi. So how would you explain to me what a taxi is? What's a taxi?
If you need to get to get to some place and you don't have your own car, you just may pay a man to sit in that car and ask him to take you somewhere.
Perfect. It's a vehicle that takes you where you want to go for money. That's the basic. So you can do that with every single word. You don't need to reach for Google Translate, which, by the way, is terrible.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, it
Awful.
should be academic with just explanation.
Yeah,
It's
you
just
can.
simple to
Yeah,
to understand.
exactly. You find a different way, and it doesn't matter how complex or abstract the word is. You can do it. Practice the sound, the spelling, and the use, because when you learn a word in English, you're actually having to learn it twice. Because you're learning the spelling, which is a symbol, and the pronunciation, which sometimes has nothing to do with the letters on the page. And I love this one. This is my favourite rule. To remember a word or a rule forever, teach it to somebody else. So I would, with my students, get them, for example, I'd send one off to go and learn 3 or 4 words. I'd send another one off to go learn 3 or 4 different words, and the next day get them to teach them to each other. And they never forgot them. Next one, please. So this is what I mean. English spelling is not phonetic. Words are symbols. You know when you see that means no entry. That symbol means something. All of these do. Because when we see it in the page and then you try and say it, as I look at my example is the word night, the old word, you know, for Britzar, K-N-I-G-H-T. Well, what's the K doing there? Or the G, or the H? But 700 years ago, that word in English was pronounced knicht. All of the O-U-G-H, the 11 versions of how to pronounce O-U-G-H, all had separate pronunciations 700 years ago. English spelling is illogical. It is crazy. So you have to learn it just as a symbol. It is not how it's pronounced. It is what those letters represent in sound.
May I ask you, does it happen so that children ask you why you write all these letters and you don't pronounce?
Yes.
Because often children ask me, and I try to explain them that it was so written many years ago, but they try to find logic in it.
Oh well, that's you know, I take my mother's way approach is because I said so. Sometimes you just have to. Yeah.
Because adults understand and children they need to explain why.
Yeah. But again, you know, we have and look at the illogicality of it. You know, the pronunciation of these words: English but engine, woman but winning. You know, cough and tough. George Bernard Shaw said that we could spell the word fish, G-H-O-T-I. You take the G-H from cough, the O from women, and the T-I from station gives you fish. So it is crazy. These are the things that people, now native speakers don't realise, because we learn it, we take it for granted. And here's another thing. Everybody today has access to technology in terms of you don't need to be that good at arithmetic. Yes, you can do it on your calculator, on your phone. How many people here write always without spell check or autocorrect? Nobody. Everybody uses spell check. Why do we make people learning English do it in exams without you know? I think it's okay to let people use spell check because in real life we use it all the time. Grammar check's different. Thank you. Everybody's favourite. Teachers love teaching idioms, especially non-native teachers. Oh, I'm going to do an idiom. Oh, let's do some swear words. But they need to put the context behind it. Because I see too many people whose language is littered with idioms but don't mean anything. But make them fun. If you have to, act them out, do a photograph, draw them if you're if you're inclined, and just learn the ones that you like. How many phrasal verbs are there in English?
The exact number.
Exactly. Approximately. There are at least 3,000, and probably more. You're never going to learn them. I don't know them all. I don't care. I learn the ones I like. Learn the ones. One of the good tips about learning vocabulary is frequency. The more you see a word, the more useful it's probably going to be. Okay, next one, please. So I used to have fun. I used to make these videos. This is my little boy. That was an idiom for to find your feet, to become accustomed to something in a new environment. Next one, please. What's this one? To throw in the towel, to give up. Just throwing the towel comes from boxing, actually. It means to give up. Next one. That's very similar to a Russian one. I don't give a fig. When you don't care. Okay. That one is actually to leave no stone unturned. In other words, to look everywhere for something. Okay, exams. I'm not a very good person to talk about exams because I hate them. Because it's big business. The ESL industry is worth $100 billion a year. $100 billion a year. Cambridge Assessment, their turnover in 2017 was 500 million euros. It is huge business. The books, the courses, the exams. I have a friend of mine who's just taken his IELTS exam for the 4th time. He got the grades he needed. And he went to Moscow, and there were 150 people taking the exam, and they do this exam every 2 weeks. Each of those people were paying $300. It is huge business. It is not in their interests to change the way that English is taught and tested because they're making too much money off it, not because it's useful. So, number one thing, and this is a problem in this country, when people do exams, you have to forget, they have to remember, they don't care how clever you are. If you're doing a writing or something, they're not interested in your insights into whatever the topic is. Like I said, if you are a chimpanzee with good English, you're going to do well. You need to divorce your intellect from your English. They are testing your English, nothing else. Very hard concept, that is. So don't waste time on being brilliant. Concentrate on producing the best English that you can. Now, if you avoid the very basic silly mistakes that everybody makes, and that's just a question of just reading through what you've written, you'll add 10% to your score. And that can make all the difference. And just remember, the English is easy in terms of the word order. The only flexibility we have, adverbs. Everything else is logical. And the passive is your friend when you're writing. Passive, we don't use it very often when we speak, but we use it all the time when we're writing, particularly in formal writing. Passive's great. It's also very easy to form. And then keep up your sleeve as your special little party trick, an inversion, second or third, mixed conditional. Just have one of those already. It is a formula. I would say in Russian it's like shablon. It is nothing to do about how good your English is, it's how good you are at passing exams. That's the problem with it. It's a problem here, it's a problem everywhere. And if you are writing, adjectives and adverbs use up words. You know, just literally, if you have to write 250 words and you've only got 230, just put some adverbs and adjectives in there. Thank you. Fear is not an option. Again, I talked about what happens to your voice when you're nervous. Don't forget to breathe. Now that sounds a really strange thing to say, but it is actually true. I was I was doing some interviews of teachers in Colombia, English teachers, and they came and they were very nervous because I'm a native speaker and all. And one woman nearly passed out. She was talking like this, and then she had to take a huge breath. Don't forget to breathe. Remember why you're speaking. And another thing when it comes to studying English, and I think this is also useful for students at university as well, is if you try and make English part of your me time, you know, your leisure time, rather than being forced. I don't like English in classrooms. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's very effective. So don't make it a chore. Make it something that's fun. And I think it's okay to study song lyrics. It's okay to study soap operas and things like that, because it's real, natural, normal English. Mostly. If you speak how they speak, what we say in England is, if you look like the photograph in your passport, you're too sick to travel. Nobody sounds like they do in the books or speaks like they do in the books. Listen to modern speakers. Listen to good actors. Like I've said, there are many of them. And rather than I'm just going to watch a movie in English, don't. Watch a movie that you like in whatever language you want if you enjoy it. But if you're going to watch for English study, watch a very short clip, YouTube clip, and then analyse the language. Why did he use that word? Why was that intonation there? That's the way to actually seriously study. And again, read social media. Social media should be an integral, central part of English teaching and English learning. And I think it's underused at the moment. Thank you. Nearly done. So, when I say that British or native speakers make mistakes, look at this. Emotions got the better of me. I shouldn't have reacted like that. Nobody who has learnt English as a foreign language would ever say that. Why has he said shouldn't have? Because the contraction shouldn't have, VE, sounds like of. I shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have done that. Because they don't know the rule, they write that. Happens all the time. Next one, please. So, we talked about Jabberwocky before. This is a poem of nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. It is, however, grammatically correct. And knowing what we do with intonation, we can bring this poem to life even though we have no idea what it's saying. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the moan wraths outgrave. I have no idea what I just said, but it sounds like I do. And that's intonation. Thank you. All right, just a little thing to finish off with. Shortest place name in Britain, in Scotland. The longest place name in Britain. Does anybody want to have a go? Anybody want to try and pronounce that? Nobody ever does. It is the longest place name in Britain in Wales. The longest place name that doesn't repeat a letter is a town in Devon called Buckfastleigh. And the only town in Britain that has a punctuation mark as part of its name, Westward Ho. Thank you. So, finally, people will only think you're stupid if you're stupid, not if you make a mistake in English. Never apologise for making a mistake. It is amazing how often people say, I'm sorry for my bad English. Why are you sorry? But then we know where as I came in, and this is how I want to finish off. The biggest progress that you and your students will make in learning English or anything is to forget the notion of perfection, because it doesn't exist. It's elusive. We're human. And I'm glad we are, because that gives us the individuality to express ourselves how we wish and how we feel. By all means, have a good base. But remember, when you're actually communicating, what is it you are trying to say? Thank you very much indeed. That actually is not my Twitter, my Instagram anymore. So.
No?
No, it's mercury.english. If anybody has any questions.
Teacher, is it necessary, or what is your attitude to use transcriptions? Is it necessary to use it?
I think they can be useful. They can be useful, but I think particularly because of this difference between pronunciation and spelling, it can be useful. But also, it helps to sort of follow where the intonation works. Some people, my view on methodology is if it's working for your student, then it's the right one. So I would never say no, yes or no.
It's a question.
Yeah. Does it work when you do it with your students? Then it's fine.
But you don't in different countries, do they use the transcription or not?
Some do, some don't. And even within countries, they you know.
And what about the translation? Because many people don't have a translation, just pictures and the word. What about?
I'm not such. You see, I'm not necessarily sure that the total immersion for beginners is a good idea. I think you need a bit of comfort of having your own language as well, just to begin with. I don't see any harm in that. But once you get to a certain level, then I think it needs to all be in the target language. I'm not one of these people who know it must all be in English, because you can actually ruin someone's confidence and make them feel very small, you know, if it's unless they're tiny children. I think it's always good to have, but what you need to do, and you get to a point where you have to kind of let go of the mama na yuka and just go straight for English all the time, but only after a certain level.
Я слушаю Ричарда, у меня родилась такая идея в голове. Думаю, почему бы нам при нашей ассоциации не создать такую секцию, отдельную секцию, которая будет называться ассоциация или секция преподавателей английского языка для высшей школы. И это будет, чтобы ее можно было интегрировать в международную, такие же вот программы международные. Почему? Потому что уже понятно, что это совершенно отдельный объект обучения. Это английский. Представляете, сколько практических сегодня мы получили рекомендаций, да, где никогда никто об этом не говорит. И нигде не прочитаешь, где-то какой-то кусочек. Но вот эта сублимация, вот когда вот это все говорится, объединяется вместе. Но мы с вами это получили, мы счастливые, да? Остальные же не получили этого всего. Значит, есть смысл, может быть, в рамках нашей ассоциации создать такой, ну, как бы, фрагмент такой, да, такой сегмент, именно для преподавателей английского языка высшей школы, потому что учителя в школах это другое совершенно. Да. И сделать такую страничку отдельно на веб-сайт, на Facebook, и тогда, может быть, сформатировать, потому что мы уже 4 года мы ставим вопрос о том, что в Украине нету национальной ассоциации преподавателей английского языка. Нету. Есть в России, есть в Казахстане, есть в Литве, есть в Молдавии, но нету в Украине. Просто мы пробовали начать это с ребятами, но все боятся взять на себя позицию лидера, что я это буду делать. Вот давайте мы предлагаем с Ричардом, я уже взяла на себя, предлагаем с Ричардом, ну, Америка, это ужасно. Понимаете, потому что я понимаю, что вы заняты, вы работаете, у вас есть непосредственная рабочая, вы очень заняты, но все равно это коллективная копилочка такая. Давайте попробуем сделать такую, ну, не закрытую группу, а открытую, чтобы любые люди подключаться и смотреть это и слушать. Вот это видео, которое записано сегодня, потому что все пишется, все наше, это все будет на страничке нашей ассоциации. Вот эти все фрагменты, давайте, придет время, и, наверное, больше к нам придет людей, больше, мы, может быть, даже сделаем когда-то отдельно только для преподавателей английского языка. Потому что, видите, чем дальше в лес, тем больше дров, тем больше сегмент деления, понимания, что это все надо разрабатывать, не может быть шаблона, нужно все делать индивидуально. Мы можем тогда пробовать переносить это, возможно, на площадке университетов, тоже отдельно каждый приглашает, и вот начинается делиться. То есть не обязательно это только Буковель вот этого, только вот в это время. Мы можем делать это в любое время года, можем делать там в Виннице, там в марте, там в апреле, там следующее. Мы можем делать это не обязательно вживую, можем делать контакт по интернету, где-то включением таким вот. Но все равно это полезно, потому что мы не будем жадными, будем у нас был такой мода spray seeds, сей семена, потому что они все равно взрастают. Надо думать хорошо, надо сеять, делать работу. И если вы не против, было бы, наверное, хорошей такой инициативой, давайте просто подумаем, кто у нас из лидеров возьмет на себя, может быть, что-то немножко писать, потому что я не могу все это писать. You're professional. Я преподаватель русского языка и литературы. Сегодня, кстати, день филолога. Приветствуем всех с днем филолога. Да, сегодня день филолога.
Вони дарма вечірку на вечір організовують.
Абсолютно. Филологи будут петь песни сегодня на всех языках.
А про вечірку можна подробніше? А про вечірку подробніше?
Да. А там, кстати, второй был такой, да. Поздравляем всех филологов, хорошо знать языки, но лучше быть айтишником, лучше стать айтишником.
Ну, до речі, вивчення іноземної мови для айтішників, вони не викладачі, але це їх робоча мова.
Да,
Абсолютно. Ми не маємо можливості чекати, поки нам щось перекладуть. Якщо ми не будемо брати оригінальну англомовну літературу, це ми будемо пасти задніх все життя. Це робоча мова.
Того перекласти жоден викладач не зможе в тих термінах, в тому розумінні, що це стосується IT.
Смотрите, мы можем получить грант под, например, разработку словарей, dictionary for IT Ukrainian, English Ukrainian, dictionary for medical English, dictionary for, дайте мне экзамен, кто еще какой-то.
В общем-то, как вы делаете? У нас же тройной перевод идет. Идет русский, английский, русский, а потом русский, украинский.
Вот, смотрите, сколько мы месяцев, возможно, opportunity, где сегодня нету English, Ukrainian, нету вот этих профессиональных. Я знаю только один словарь, над которым имела возможность тоже помогать работать. Это был English Financial and Economic, где банки профинансировали. English Ukrainian Financial and Economics.
That has to be a support, a tool, rather than the engine itself. Because what happens is you can learn the glossary, but if you can't express it, it's pointless. So it has to be a tool, not an engine itself.
Absolutely, yeah, but it is, speaking about that, they need these tools.
Of course, absolutely, yeah.
Tools is necessary, absolutely. Ты не можешь ничего сделать. Ты не можешь получить jewelry without making them. Технологии сделать это. Вот поэтому,
Елена,
смотрите.
еще один вопрос.
Да.
Мы столкнулись с тем, что люди с ограниченными возможностями. Для глухонемых практически не существует словаря, айтишного словаря в принципе. И очень тяжело. Я пытался найти даже на английском языке, как передать при помощи языка знаков файл. Открыть файл, закрыть файл. Нас. Open file, close file.
Science в этих сигналах.
Это есть учебники, но английский, американский бритиш, это разные все сайты для глухонемых.
Что самое
У
интересное?
американцев свои знаки, у англичан свои знаки, потом в Австралии другие.
Подскажите, потому что это проблема.
А в Украине?
А в Украине вообще это не
Абсолютно. Абсолютно.
Ну вот смотрите, сколько возможностей, вот если прагматично говорить, мы для чего собралась наша ассоциация? Для того, чтобы, естественно, generate ideas, но и в то же время возможность получить support. Этот support из гранты. Это грант, которые деньги, которые могут быть выделены, но на определенную конкретную работу такую. Такую же работу, как со словарями, такую же работу, как организация тренингов, на разработку этих тренингов. Такая же работа над этим вот, по работе с инвалидами тоже. И на самом деле есть много очень фондов, которые готовы это финансировать, но нам нужно с вами это подать. Надо сформатировать эти документы и подать и получить. И это хорошая возможность заработать деньги и хорошая возможность вырастить свои знания, потому что это работа.
И обеспечить рабочие места этим.
Совершенно верно. И даже студентов в PhD, если не получится. Поэтому очень вас просим, будьте более активны в этом, потому что мы знаем дороги, как вас привести к этому, но мы не можем без вас этого сделать. Это ваша непосредственная вот, работа. Мы говорим об этом 5-й год. Мы, к сожалению, пока не родили ни одного гранта, да? Не родили. Знаете почему? Потому что мы не хотим его родить искусственно. Мы хотим, чтобы оно вот вместе с вами созрело. Не просто родить его, повесить вам на голову этот грант, чтобы оно потом опять перешло в формальную. Я готова вас ознакомить с нашими правилами. И как и ассоциация, поскольку у меня уже большой опыт работы в некоммерческих организациях, к счастью, ваше новое положение о работе общественных организаций уже толерантное, уже, по крайней мере, с этим можно работать. Раньше это было просто вообще зажим, везде ничего нельзя было делать. Сегодня уже легче регистрироваться, легче работать, лучше принимать вот эти финансирования. Мы говорим о том, что ассоциация как платформа может принять на себя грант, мы всегда будем, мы говорили о 30% или сколько, мы от любой суммы оставляем эти деньги на, так сказать, на разработку, на развитие организации. Остальная сумма поступает практически это ваши деньги, на которые вы будете работать, если, но наш суппорт, понимание и дороги, которые мы вам приведем, вот это очень важно, потому что статусность, вы знаете, что ни одна грантовая программа, она, кроме индивидуальных грантов, там где индивидуальные гранты, она предусматривает статус общественной организации, которая должна быть не моложе 5 лет. Каждая организация, которая запрашивает грант, должна дать бюджет, должна показать свою активити, что уже работает в этом поле, должна показать свой бюджет, что она четко расписывает, на что пойдут эти деньги. И в этом бюджете она не может просить 100% гранта. Она должна быть только определенная, обоснованная, там 60-70%, но ты должен внести свои. Это должны быть или помещения, или предметные какие-то вещи, или деньги конкретные. Поэтому мы готовы, мы понимаем, что мы готовы идти на спонсирование таких вещей, но мы без вас это не сможем сделать. Если думаете об этом, предлагайте, пожалуйста. Мы будем тоже, мы готовы открыто ехать к вам каждому отдельно, говорить на ваших кафедрах, говорить в ваших университетах. Но сегодня университеты в Украине из обучающих должны переходить в научную сферу. Все-таки в науку, больше в науку. Развивайте на основании своих знаний, развивайте больше украинскую науку. Украинскую науку, потому что вы все равно должны British Council, всевозможные методики, все хорошо. У вас должна быть украинская методика преподавания английского языка, потому что она все равно растет на тех людях, которых вы знаете. Это должен быть ваш way. Ну, не помню, вы не согласны со мной?
В принципе, да. Но я как и говорю, что то, что получается для каждого студента, это правильно. If you just say it must be, I want people to get away from this, you have to do it this way or that way. You do it whatever way works.
Right, но надо накопить эти предложения и дать это людям, чтобы они имели какую-то инструкцию, какие-то журналы, magazines, которые они могли бы шерить между собой, какой-то инструмент вот этого всего. Смотрите, я сделала простую вещь. Я просто набрала в Google все английское, преподавание английского языка, значит, где? В России, в Казахстане. Посмотрите, вот для себя даже интересно. В России, в Казахстане, в Литве, в Молдавии, ну, в Украине. В Украине это получилось, что оно немножко есть, что входят международные ассоциации сразу, но нету национальной украинской. Так смотрите, что у россиян? У них вся ассоциация английского языка заключается в том, что они между собой собираются и они расписывают, поскольку денег они будут брать за вот этот вот, да, что стоит столько, что они просто посадили жесткую конкретную кальку и сказали, не вздумайте никто без нашей ассоциации ни одного там подписать документы, вы нам должны платить, вы нам платите, мы тогда вам разрешаем вот этим заниматься. Серьезно вам говорю. В Казахстане немножко лучше, они более пошли, но они там больше следят за эмоциями, у них проблема вот именно азиатов, у них не все pronunciation, не все звуки выговариваются, у них там определенная проблема. Но, ну, потому что там дочь Назарбаева, она училась в Гарварде, она больше курирует, они более приближены, у них несколько институтов американских и британских открыто в территории Казахстана, они более открыты. Поэтому Литва очень, девочки, ну, девочки, потому что в основном женский коллектив, они более коммуникируют. У них ассоциация по принципу, они приглашают к себе людей и делают такие конференции все время. У них вот это входные, выходные конференции, выездные конференции к ним. Но все равно это сообщества какие-то уже организовались. Понимаете, у нас есть возможность немножко, может быть, другой даже формат заявить. Но это определенно нужно делать. Я предлагаю такой формат начать вот с этого нашего Буковеля как сегмент в самой ассоциации. Если она разовьется и лидеры выйдут, те, кто возьмет на себя там, роль президента, то под ядро ассоциации, выходите нам не жалко, выходите в национальный, регистрируйтесь и делайтесь отдельной ассоциацией. Но научиться работать, понимаете, вот этим механизмом, и выбрать определенные стили работы, что это будет, как это будет. Окей? Если вы не против, можем начать разговаривать на эту тему. Но тогда нам надо создать такую или группу в Facebook, или какую-то группу в Instagram, где-то, где мы можем коммуникировать в любое время. Так. Ваше имя?
Алла.
Алла. Все подойдем к Алле и дадим свои фамилии и свой имейл, окей? И Алла у нас заберет всех над нашим этим. Так получилось. Первая сидишь, ничего не сделаешь. Просто по номеру 1. На букву А, тем более, да. Алла, все пришло.
Ну, имеется в виду преподаватель английского языка, правильно?
Да, давайте определимся четко, что это преподаватель английского языка высшей школы. Да. А тогда мы уже будем говорить и о тьюторах, будем тогда говорить о всяких других инструментах. Сначала нам надо будет набраться больше знаний, получить в себя, а тогда мы уже сможем что-то, ну хотя бы это будет уже какая-то системная работа.
What's interesting in British schools in the last 10 years, English teaching as a foreign language has become part of the curriculum. Because where my friend lives, he's in charge of 12 academies in the east of England. 40% of the students are Lithuanian or Latvian, and they come and they go straight into classes, and so they've had to sort of readdress how they teach English, and they have it, and they don't do it using native English teachers. They use Lithuanians and Latvians because it's a bit easier.
Абсолютно. Вот я живу в Америке, и ко мне, я филолог русского языка, преподаватель русского языка и литературы по первой специальности, и приходит ко мне: давай ты будешь обучать русскому языку американцев. Я не могу, это другая совершенно технология, я не могу им сказать: мама мыла раму, букварь взять, у меня все учебники русского языка, я не могу их обучать русскому языку.
Другая методика.
Совершенно другая методика. Мне пришлось запросить книги, мне, кстати, из Санкт-Петербурга прислали, моя коллега, моя приятельница по университету, прислала книги, где действительно они сейчас обучают китайцев, где они обучают...
У нас тоже есть, если вам надо будет, у нас есть академичное отделение, потому что у нас очень много иностранцев.
Так вам надо по украинскому языку,
Есть, да,
обучение украинского языка, да. И еще я вам скажу такую совершенно уникальную вещь, которую вы, наверное, не знаете. У нас в Америке нету украинской школы ни одной. Нету преподавания украинского языка, его нету. Не только у вас проблемы, у нас проблемы с украинским. Знаете почему? Потому что украинцы, которые были в зарубежье, они определились как група закордонного українства, і вони викладають за методикою Нью-Йоркської школи української мови. Кошаківка, пукалка, це західноукраїнська гуцульська мова. І коли ми прийшли і говоримо, що є фонд Яцика, є нормальні ці, ми принесли їм українську, Україна як країна, існує